wanna pick up girls and get called asshole. This never happened to Pablo Picasso. He could walk down your street and girls could not resist the stare, and so Pablo Picasso was never called an asshole.
Hello and welcome to For All That episode number 33. And Andrew and I are joined this time by Thomas Widmann, who blogs at Arc of Prosperity, which is the Indy debate from a Scandinavian perspective. And that Scandinavian perspective is because he's our first guest from Denmark. How's it going, Thomas?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. And Andrew, how have you been? We've been off for a couple of weeks, and every time we do this, there seems to be an inferno every time we take a week off, and there's been about 400. Just to liven up the Scottish political scene, I think we should take a week off more often because it always happens. So, how are you doing?
Yeah, no, I'm grand. I'm just in the last month of writing my thesis, so I've got the wild, mad, staring eyes of a bunny caught in front of a juggernaut. But otherwise, I'm quite enjoying the distraction, as you say, of the inferno, which is engulfing Scottish political affairs.
So just before we start properly, did you both get that £100 in the post?
No.
No, neither did I. Yeah.
All right, we need to sort that out. Maybe our computer systems were hacked and it didn't post right. But okay, so I suppose that should be our first topic. For me, it's really a non-topic, but I suppose we'll go to our guest Thomas first. What did you make of the Bulmer story and the £100?
I just thought it was so clearly a non-story from that point of view. I mean, at first I didn't know what to make of it really, but then the Herald came out and said we were offered the story by Yes Scotland. They were the ones who sent the article to the Herald, so any fault of not declaring what was going on was down to the Herald. I don't think Yes Scotland and Dr. Bulmer did anything wrong, to be honest, but the no side just blew it up beyond all proportions.
Yeah, and Andrew, did you have any thoughts on it in particular?
Well, I mean, I think it reflects on the impoverishment of our freelance academics that you need to pay them £100. I thought along the lines that Thomas was just saying that in many ways it was much less significant than people represented it to be. However, I think it's also very predictable that if Better Together found out that they'd been paying independent academics for their work, for perfectly understandable reasons, I would understand why Dr. Will may have asked for it. And Dr. Wilmer's views on the Constitution are, as I understand them, pretty stable, pretty consistent, and he's been making his arguments for a long period of time. So there's no case here that he was unduly influenced or was just being a kind of dubious freelancer on this. But the same must be said that Caesar's wife must be above reproach. Well, not really, but if you're dealing with a highly cynical opposition, it behoves Yes Scotland to be highly cynical themselves and to wargame all of this through. And I think it's quite foreseeable and a bit naive, to be honest, that paying somebody for copy when really you're not being transparent about it, because you're not going to tell anyone. The difference between concealing something and not telling people about it is pretty slender. So I think it's not the greatest thing in the world, but it does show a certain lack of savvy and a lack of cynicism. And let's face it, we need a bit of cynicism with our positive campaigning, to quote Stephen Noon, who was on your Scott Indy pod earlier on this week, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's predictable that something like that would be jumped upon, but at the same time, I think the campaign and the coverage so far has shown us that even if there isn't anything to jump on, they'll invent something. At this point, I think we've seen that often enough. And to disagree a little bit with Stephen Noon, who was on my podcast, I think there might be an element of needing to fight back and say, look, this is bollocks at this point. Thomas?
Yeah, absolutely. Every campaign needs attack dogs and reasonable, nice people. And it's just like the Yes campaign is so focused on being nice and not being seen to be bullies so that you don't scare away the Undecideds, that the attack dog element is almost missing. It's just down to individual bloggers and so on to provide the aggressive element at times.
One thing I was saying just before we came on this topic is that is there a lesson here from 2011, the Holyrood election, which is being mislearned in some ways? I mean, you often hear from Salmond and others saying that the SNP ran a very positive campaign in 2011 about vision and competence and all that, and to an extent that's true. But also, those of us that opened up copies of The Sun will remember that the tabloids ran an immensely negative campaign about the Labour Party, extending to the describing Ian Gray, whoever he is. That was what was in the Sun during the election process.
Exactly. If the Sun and several other tabloids at the moment were running a vicious campaign against Better Together, then we could afford to be just 100% positive. I totally agree with that. And I also think that there is this thing that the Holyrood election had many parties running, and in a multi-party election, you can afford to be very, very positive, because negativity will help those of your opponents that you're not attacking at that one time. In a first-past-the-post election, such as a Westminster election or a referendum, where normally there's only two horses in the running, harming your opponent is just as important as helping yourself. And so I think there's some room for some negativity, but it depends on the context. If you're on the doorstep talking to undecided voters, of course you want to be positive and agreeing with them as far as possible. You don't want to tell them they're being idiots for not having read up on the latest stories in the blogosphere.
True. And that brings us nicely actually to our second topic, which is, you mentioned speaking to undecideds on the doorstep. There seems to be a fairly solidified yes and no camp. So, I mean, who are the undecideds? What kind of groups of society are they, Andrew?
Yeah, I think it's really an interesting question and an important one. In the context of what Thomas was just saying there, I thought it was interesting, thinking just to go back to the positivity question. Recently, the ex-leader of the SNP has referred to the cancer of the south of England, which is a bit rich for my blood, to be honest. But I think there is maybe consequences of foregoing any sort of negativity, because presumably one of the reasons why you wish an independent Scotland, whatever kind of independent Scotland you want, but one of the big reasons why you'd want to go the independence route is because the UK is insufficient. Is inadequate, doesn't serve your needs, or worse, has certain pernicious aspects which you hope to correct with an independent sovereign state which is controlled by Scottish democratic institutions. I understand that the reaction to the comments by Gordon Wilson about cancer for Better Together folk were very negative. I understand that language is far too far from me, and I think Thomas is absolutely right as well. We have to work out, in terms of talking to folk who are undecided, it's not right to treat the independence question as foregone. It's not right to sort of imply that all the sensible, intelligent people are in favour of yes, and you're just a numpty or undereducated if you think no. But on the other hand, if we get to the position where you feel paralysed and we accept a framing of this debate where you can't criticise the Westminster government, the Westminster Parliament, the British state in any way, and if that's kind of enforced by this discourse is enforced by Better Together campaigners, then we're absolutely stuffed, because there is a negative kernel to any sort of Scottish national argument, I would say, which is going to inevitably be there. And if we remove the sort of strength and steel from that critique of what's wrong with Britain, then there's no argument whatever to be independent, I don't think. Sorry, that's a bit of a...
But you're absolutely right, if I might come in here. I mean, we've seen several stories recently also about how London are not happy about the state of the United Kingdom, and more London politicians are talking about London should go independent and so on. We're just seeing that the UK is a broken state, is a failed state in many ways. And I think Scottish independence is a reaction to that, to saying that the UK is not delivering anymore for us. We can do better ourselves. I think there's a reason why Scottish people were not trying to obtain independence 100 years ago, because back then the UK was in the main delivering for Scotland, but UK just isn't anymore.
I think there always was a current of independence support even 100 years ago. But don't you think the Olympic opening ceremony papered over all the cracks and everything's fine now?
Mary Poppins fixes everything, particularly you have hundreds of them gliding from the sky.
Yeah, but this is I agree with what Thomas is saying. The UK is in many respects a failed state, but what all they seem to be doing to try and fix it is more and more pageantry. There's a sort of serious point with the Olympic opening ceremony. If it's not Olympic opening ceremony, it's the Jubilee. If it's not the Jubilee, it's the Royal Baby. Next year they're going to be doing these celebrations of the beginning of the First World War, which I find is slightly odd.
It's offensive, to be honest.
Yeah,
I mean, I have a very international background. I'm not 100% Danish. I have German family too, and I have family in Italy and other places. So to me, beginnings of wars are horrible events that really, beginnings of wars should only be commemorated in really, really somber ways.
yeah.
The end of wars you can celebrate to your heart's content, but not the beginning of wars. It's completely, I find it offensive, to be perfectly honest.
I find most of Westminster offensive, to be perfectly honest. Most things that go on there. But just to come back to that. Sorry. So the Undecideds, who are they? Does anyone want to take that one up?
Yeah, well, I sorry, it was me that knocked the horse from its way. One thing I just think is really interesting about undecided voters, and this was put into my mind by listening to a psephologist talking about America, and I know America and Scotland are not the same, but bear with me. He was talking about the way that undecideds are represented in the American political sphere. They're often, in terms of these presidential campaigns, represented as a really big block of voters. They are often understood to be betwixt and between Republicans and Democrats, and actually, his point was that there's a much smaller group of undecided people in the American constituencies anyway than is often represented, and generally the presidential election won't turn to the extent that the press represent it will on them. But also that they're ideologically much to the right, and are not betwixt and between the Republicans and Democrats in general, but are ways all over the place, which is increasingly a consequence of far right kind of Tea Party or folk leaving the Republican Party and becoming independent. But still, they're not going to vote Democrat because they're quite right wing. And I just thought about the parallels in the Scottish context here, that we often imagine undecided voters, and you hear people talking about undecided voters as being kind of soft pro-devolutionist people who are betwixt and between no and yes, and that kind of polarized logic, I think, encourages this vision of undecideds who are kind of drifting in the middle of the spectrum, who can be potentially snared by one side or the other if they manage to pitch their arguments correctly, persuasively. And just the American caution against how we conceive of undecided voters made me wonder as well if the way we think about them in the Scottish context is actually quite as persuasive as it is hegemonic.
You're making me think it's like the people are maybe looking at it in the way that undecideds are presented in a UK election. The south of England's blue, the north of England and Scotland is red, and it's those bits in the middle that float between blue and red that they're trying to battle over. The way you're describing it sort of reminds me of that.
There's also the problem with, from a more conversational point of view, when you are out knocking on doors, you will have many people telling you they're undecided, but I think it's also just because that's the polite way of saying that they don't want to tell you. Because there are far too many. When I'm out knocking doors, then I would say there's a most 20% no and at the most 20% yes. And that's not what you find in the opinion polls. So a very large group of people must be telling me they don't know, just because they find it's easier than telling a stranger what they're going to vote. And I think there's that too, that unless you've decided very strongly and you're 100% convinced and you actually know why you're going to vote that way, it's easier, even in an anonymous opinion poll, it's easier just to say, I don't really know yet.
Can I just ask you about that? This sounds like a sort of flippant question, but it isn't. Do don't cares get lumped in with don't knows as well? Like when you're out speaking to people on the doorstep, do you get many I don't care?
Not that many, I think, but again, it's hard to tell, I think, because you get people who clearly don't want to talk and just want me to go away again. Whether that's because I don't care or whether they're just introverts or something, it's hard to tell.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, and maybe to just put a wee bit more flesh on some of the bones of what I was saying there about undecideds. I mean, you're talking undecideds about what happens in the ballot box. Yes, no, or will I not bother? Will I sit at home in my pants and eat a cake instead? And those are kind of the options which present themselves. But it's not neatly capturing the extent of reasons which might prompt people one way and the other. I mean, I know we've had this conversation in my family when I was talking to like my mother and sister about it, who were much more undecided and much more waverable one way or the other than my committed nationalist father is. And the kind of issues they brought up were ones which are about, what are their key political concerns? What are the things which are most important to them politically? And different people will have different political concerns and different issues which cause them to be undecided, if you like, and different ways of framing the debate. So, for example, if I feel that being British is important to